The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact of their business, and proactively address threats head-on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to HackSurfer's weekly podcast. Today is Friday, December 19th, 2014. Joining us today, we have Michael Fell, Surfwatch Labs data analyst, Jeff Peters, the editor at HackSurfer, and I'm Matt Lightfuss. I'm a writer for HackSurfer. A little later after the podcast, join us for our interview. Jeff had the opportunity to interview Mark Gazit. Gazit is the CEO of ThetaRay, and they chat about critical infrastructure and the increase in nation-states participating in cyber warfare. So what's everyone talking about this week? Well, we have the Sony incident, of course, but what's going on besides Sony? Mike, could you kind of fill us in on that?
Sure thing. This week, the German Federal Office of Information Security released a report describing some incidents in Germany. One of the most interesting incidents was a cyber attack on a German steel plant. The report doesn't go into much specifics, but what ended up happening was an advanced persistent threat group with advanced knowledge of industrial control systems used spear phishing attacks to access the plant's office network, eventually accessing the production network of the steel plant. The report claims that the attackers caused significant damage to control components and entire production machines. The outages and other issues prevented the plant from appropriately shutting down a blast furnace, resulting in significant damage to the plant, the report claims. This is a pretty interesting story since everyone's focused on Sony, but really we've been noticing in Surfwatch Labs data increased discussion and chatter about industrial control systems, which is a pretty significant topic when you think about it.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting story as well. Interesting timing, I guess, because like Matt was saying, I got the chance to chat with Mark Gazit, and that's something that he brought up is we're kind of talking about, why critical infrastructure kind of goes under the radar. And he was saying, a lot of times stuff like this will happen, like you mentioned, a blast furnace won't be able to shut down or something will kind of stop working, and a lot of times it's hard to attribute it to a cyber attack. So it's not really as public, when it comes to critical infrastructure. And he was just talking about how in 2015 he was predicting we're going to see a lot more kind of attacks along those lines. But we'll play that interview once we get done with our discussion, and everyone can listen in if you're interested in that topic. One thing we thought would be interesting, this is actually going to be our last podcast of 2014 as we're taking off next week because of Christmas. So we thought it'd be good for, each of us to point out what are, I guess, the top stories or the most interesting things that sort of stood out to us in 2014. I guess Matt, being the new guy, you weren't here the whole year, but is there anything that stood out to you or, when you kind of look back at your couple months you've been here?
When I started in September, and it was right in the middle of the Home Depot data breach, but the one that really stood out to me, and maybe it's because I'm a card holder with the company, was the data breach of JPMorgan Chase. And if people remember, 76 million households and 7 million businesses had credentials compromised. However, with this attack, what was really talked about, there's no evidence that anything was actually stolen. They might have our credentials, but as you see with a lot of these retail breaches, they weren't finding any of these stolen credit cards being used. So we don't know who is behind the attack yet. We can talk about it, but as we have mentioned before, attribution behind these attacks is nearly impossible in most times. And what does that mean for the future? These are all things I started thinking about. JPMorgan Chase is the biggest bank in the world, if I'm not mistaken, and banks spend a lot of money on security. So for me, that I guess it, not to be like a doomsdayer, I don't want to say it terrified me, but it scared me a little bit. If a bank like that can be compromised and we don't know who did it or what they were actually after, I'm nervous about the future for what the implications behind an attack like that could be.
Yeah, and I think their CEO's name is Jamie Dimon. I remember hearing from him they were talking about doubling their cybersecurity spending. They had spent I think like $250 million. They were gonna up it to $500 million. They're basically looking at investing $500 billion. They're looking at investing $500 million into cybersecurity. So I mean that's a huge amount of money. To your point, I think with JPMorgan Chase, with Home Depot, with Target, with Sony, with all these things, there's a lot of huge businesses, in the news. So I guess it just kind of proves the point that everyone's vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of these high-profile data breaches, I think business leaders and the C-suite are starting to realize that they need to pay more attention to these sorts of issues, or they don't want to get exposed in the press. They call the Washington Post test. They don't want to be on the front page of the Washington Post because it's embarrassing for them. It's embarrassing for their investors. So I think with this, I think next year in 2015, I wouldn't be surprised to see an uptick in investment in a lot of data security solutions by these big major corporations and other capabilities.
What stood out to me this year, I was actually reading an article just this morning. A lot of people have been talking about this Sony attack and saying it's unprecedented, just in terms of, the actors weren't really going after any information. They're just trying to cause destruction. And, I was kind of thinking about that. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Going back to like one of the first interviews I ever did here on HackSurfer, I interviewed James Phelps. Matt, I think you've interviewed him as well.
Excellent source of information.
Yeah, he's a really cool guy. But when I asked him trends, this was probably, I think like June of 2013. One of the things that he brought up was just, cyber extortion and people kind of holding data hostage and ransomware kind of stuff. So I thought that was kind of interesting that was like one of the very first interviews I did, because I think this is all sort of connected. Basically, end of 2013, we had CryptoLocker kind of hit the scene, and, all this ransomware basically kind of in a similar way. It doesn't necessarily destroy data, but if you don't pay to get it decrypted, then it's pretty much destroyed. Then also this year we saw CodeSpaces got put out of business by hackers. That was June 2014. Basically, an attacker gained access to the company's Amazon Web Services control panel, tried to do some kind of extortion, but then the company didn't comply right away, and then the attacker ended up basically deleting huge amounts of their data and basically put the company out of business. Then also another story that just came out, Bloomberg Business Week was talking about an attack on Sands Casino that cost at least $40 million in damage. So I think that's sort of the trend that stands out to me, looking at Sony, is kind of we've had this trend with ransomware and some of these attacks basically really causing physical damage to various companies, including Sony.
And Jeff, just to add, these are the attacks that we know about. Mm-hmm. We don't even know there could have been other businesses affected by ransomware and these sort of data wiping things that never reported or said anything to anyone about them. So yeah, it is a very disturbing and interesting trend.
Matt, is there any other things that stood out to you this year?
Yeah. I want to talk about, and maybe it's because it's my favorite little sandwich shop, but this, for whatever reason, guys, Jeff, when you interviewed me, you told me that eventually I'm going to become paranoid. And this is the one that made me paranoid and really starting to consider cybersecurity. The Jimmy John's breach. To me, why this stood out is because I think that they do what a lot of companies do. They were compromised through their third-party point-of-sale vendor, and which was Signature Systems. So Signature Systems was breached, leading to Jimmy John's compromising a lot of their customers' data. So that's the first part. But then if you take a look at Signature Systems, because they were breached, they actually affected over 100 other smaller restaurants. So just the reach of something like that is, it can be a pretty big deal. And it really made me start to think about, okay, what am I doing to protect my data? So if a company is compromised, which we're seeing this year, you probably should just assume that's what's going to happen. What are you doing to protect your data? And that's to me, that event stood out because that's the event that made me think, okay, I need to take my personal security a lot more seriously.
Yeah, I guess what really stands out to me about the Jimmy John's breach is that, in a way, it was Signature Systems, the point of sale vendor, that was really at fault. But if you look at the Surfwatch Labs data, there's way more chatter about Jimmy John's than there is about Signature Systems. So I think we've seen studies and stuff in the past that show that consumers really hold, the businesses accountable, and rightfully so. But that's, something to think about as a business, your vendors and your supply chain. If they have a breach, you're going to be the one held accountable.
And I think I actually saw it, and this was a while back, and I think I wrote an article on it. I mean, this is a while ago. I think there's actually a lady who is suing Jimmy John's for this breach. You know what I mean? So just to go along with what you said, I mean, Signature Systems is really the group that let this happen, but I'll have to look, but I'm 90% positive that a lady right now, people can go look it up. One person is actually suing Jimmy John's over this.
Yeah, I actually was reading an article about this recently because the same thing's happened with Sony. They're getting sued. And, I don't know too much about the legal side of stuff, but they were basically saying that I think that's pretty common that these kind of lawsuits follow these breaches, but usually they get thrown out because it's really hard to show, as an individual, as a consumer, it's hard to show, damage because the bank's going to reimburse you for any fraud. So most of these lawsuits get thrown out. But they were saying with the Sony one that one might actually have some legs just because, I think the massive size of it and some of the other information that went out, they might actually be able to, that lawsuit might actually, have some weight to it. I guess moving on, Mike, is there anything that stood out to you this year?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. One was the criminals increasingly targeting Apple products. Just looking through our Surfwatch data for the year, I've noticed that there are a lot of events that are criminal activity that Apple products were more or less involved in, the compromise of Apple products. Some examples are, I've constantly seen stories through our data about new forms of Apple malware, whether it's state-sponsored malware, it's criminal malware, and they're targeting iOS devices and Mac, traditional Apple OS devices too. And the other big story is the celebrity phone hacking or phone data breach issue that happened earlier this year. I've said this before, and I feel like I'm beating the same old drum, but consumers in business need to really wake up and realize that your Apple devices are no longer, and I quote, safe. As Apple's market share increases when it comes to computers and mobile devices, criminals are going to start seeing that, are going to start customizing their malware and everything to address that shift in the marketplace. So that was one of the interesting stories that I had this year.
I was just going to throw in there, Mike, that I think probably a couple months ago, I wrote a story on HackSurfer kind of comparing Apple to Android. And what really stood out to me was Android actually had more cybercrime discussion for the year, but Apple was right below it. It'd be interesting to look, once 2014 is complete, there's a chance that, Apple might actually have more discussion, around cybercrime, as tracked by Surfwatch Labs than Android, which I thought was kind of interesting because everyone always talks about how Android is so much more insecure than Apple, and there's kind of that perception there. But so I thought that was interesting, just if you look at the overall cybercrime discussion, that Apple is neck and neck with Android.
And if you look at the data, and I haven't looked at this data before, but in the past I've looked at the market share between Android devices versus Apple. Our Surfwatch Labs data reflects that trend, where Android devices, since they have the majority of the market because of various reasons, criminals will target that. But since Apple's a close second, and maybe even a little more, there's going to be more discussion. So it's an interesting trend.
Yeah, and Apple gets more popular every day. I think it was last month I wrote an article where Apple had a record market share. So we see this happening. We're hearing all about these, compromises through Apple and the new developments with Apple malware, but people are still, they want Apple products. And I don't think that's going to go away. And to kind of what you said, Mike, the more popular it gets and the bigger the product becomes, they're going to have more targets. They're going to paint a bigger target on their back.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, especially with businesses and bring your own devices. That's something that they have to increasingly be aware of, is kind of making sure that those devices are secure. But Mike, is there anything else that stood out to you in 2014 you want to chat about?
Yeah, the final thing that I want to really discuss is this whole Sony story. Now that everyone has officially assumed that North Korea is responsible for it, and that's a whole other discussion regarding, attribution and everything, because some people are still skeptical. But the White House believes that, yes, North Korea was responsible for the attack or played some sort of role in the attack. And now it comes down to, how will the government respond? And that's just something interesting. I don't want to get into the specifics of everything, because that's a whole rabbit hole that, is difficult to get into. But, it's interesting how they feel comfortable saying North Korea did this. Are the United States government going to respond to that attack? Can you really attack in kind? That's an option. Could you have some sort of economic sanctions? Well, we already have that with North Korea. So it's going to be interesting to see the next steps, to see what happens, because it's going to be precedent setting, I believe.
And with that, and I could go on a political rant for years, and that this is definitely not the forum for that, but let's say the government were to intervene and do something with this. Now, I don't much care for North Korea or what they do over there, but so are we going to, like when the Syrian Electronic Army took down Forbes, should the government get involved in that? You know what I mean? It's
exactly. It's about precedence.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. I was reading that Bloomberg Business Week story about the Sands Casino, which is a great story if you guys get a chance to read it. It's called An Iranian Hacker in Every Server. But in there, they were kind of comparing the Sands Casino attack to the Sony attack, and what they concluded was both hacks may represent the beginning of a geopolitically confusing and potentially devastating phase of digital conflict. Experts worry that America's rivals may have found the sweet spot of cyberwar. Strikes that are serious enough to wound American companies, but below the threshold that would trigger a forceful government response. So yeah, I think that's kind of what we're talking about is, at what point does the government sort of step in and provide a forceful response? And it's, to this point, at least to date, there really hasn't been many situations where really the government is going to respond to any kind of attacks in a physical way or economic way. So moving on to the cyber tip of the week, I kind of brought this up earlier when I spoke to James Phelps. He was one of the first people that I interviewed for HackSurfer. This was back in June of 2013. He said, extortion to get your system restored after it's been locked up on you is the real threat that's coming down the road. And what's going to ultimately happen is you're going to see more people reverting to off-site data storage and secure systems to maintain it's not really their infrastructure, but their records. So that was in June 2013, and that's kind of, I think, a telling tip, seeing everything that's happened with Sony and all these other companies. You really have to make sure that you have your stuff backed up with all the ransomware and this trend of physical destruction that's kind of emerged in the last couple months. All right, that's it for this week's discussion around 2014. Coming up, we have an interview with Mark Gazit. He's the CEO of ThetaRay, which is based in Israel. And we got to chat about cyber war and critical infrastructure and all that stuff for a while. The edited conversation follows. Wondering, just kind of, for someone more sort of on the inside and more in the know, obviously, than I am, if there's any sort of specific, like, new concerns or kind of trends kind of around the topic that you might want to talk about?
Yeah, definitely. I think something very interesting is happening, and I believe that 2015 will be an amazing year for those dealing with critical infrastructure. Because we definitely see a trend of this, I should say, a very gentle line that still exists between critical infrastructure and physical infrastructure starting to disappear. General Electric has recently, in October, announced its Industrial Internet Initiative. And basically the idea is that today there are many machines, and those machines don't have a unified way to be connected to the Internet, or even to be connected among themselves. If you think about it, the mobile phone we're using does have an operating system. Your TV set does have an operating system. Even your fridge might have an operating system, but $20 million turbine doesn't have one. It's just a piece of metal. A locomotive, which costs much more, doesn't have an operating system. And the big change that is driven by GE, what we see today, about 100 companies being members in the industrial consortium, we see that currently operating system has been developed for all those big pieces of metal. And I believe that 2015 will be the first year where we will see release of those big turbines, machines, etc., coming with operating system, being connected to some network of machines, and will definitely create a lot of opportunities to make better profit, to reduce unplanned downtime, but it's also will introduce additional risks and additional capabilities to cause damage for hackers. So I see 2015 as the first year of this transformation that the internet is going through from internet of people towards internet of machines. Today, according to some researchers, there are already 25 billion devices speaking with each other, which very soon will become 50 billion. So one trend will be the connectivity of machines. And the second trend will be rise of automatic detection machines. You might call it machine-based policing of this amazing but yet dangerous world of Internet of Machines or industrial Internet.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, like everyone's talking about, malware on smartphones now as, smartphones are growing so rapidly. But it seems to me like, obviously with machines, that's a much bigger concern. I would imagine, at least in my mind it is, if there's people are kind of attacking this infrastructure and this Internet of Machines like you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, let's look at financial institutions and let's see what's happening really, what really happened during the last year or two, and I think it's increasing will be increasing during 2015. First of all, the way to attack organizations has really changed. If before we had an idea of people outside the organization attacking computers inside the organization, and they have a great wall that protects us against the outer threats, and then we have a gateway or a firewall, which is a gatekeeper, and maybe we have a sandbox that will sort of check all the bad guys that come into our organization. Now it's totally different. Now there is no inside and outside. The perimeter has disappeared. And today, a person that comes into organization with his mobile phone actually have a supercomputer, Wi-Fi enabled hacking device. And of course, there are thumb drives that might be introduced into organizations, insiders that make mistakes or break into organizations maliciously. So the ways to attack are different. And when we talk about industrial institutions, or even financial institutions, we talk about systems that have been built 10 or 15 years ago, sometimes even more, which are really not ready even for the sort of simple hacking practices, not talking about the advanced persistent threats and 0 days. And then let's think about the world of the attackers. The world of the attackers also has changed. If in the past we have hackers that would like their passion was to deface your website, to show that they broke into the system and stole the list of the users, and just sort of get some respect from their peers. Today, we have government that's using cyber warfare as another way to sort of gain advantage over another nation. The justification for that is financial. Today, it's much, much cheaper to shut down a remote power plant using cybersecurity attack than to send a missile or an airplane with a bomb. In some cases, you can't even do it because you will be easily detected. And we see government-based on organizations doing it. Of course, there are the sort of classic nations that we'll not mention since it's a global podcast, but I think everybody knows what we're talking about. But we suddenly have much smaller nations, newcomers. For example, Korea, that didn't like a movie created by Sony and allegedly breaks into its system. So I think today even the sort of second-tier governments develop cyber warfare capabilities, again, because it's much cheaper, much more effective. People usually forget that those people work for the military, then finish the army service, or they have friends and they share the knowledge with them. And then suddenly you see cyber criminals using almost the same means to just gain financial gain from hacking into bank accounts, threatening governments, and I think we will see more of those instances going on.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because whenever I read about cyber warfare or things like that, I mean, it's almost always tied to critical infrastructure, but it doesn't seem like it's usually more about, at least what I read, it's more about espionage or information gathering. For example, there was this Operation Cleaver that came out in the news not too long ago, targeted 50 companies across 16 countries. And it said it had the ability to launch attacks, or at least they likely thought it did, but for the most part, they kind of try to stay under the radar, like you were saying earlier. So from my perspective, we haven't really seen a lot of, I guess, like physical damage or physical attacks. Would you agree with that? And do you think that might change in the future?
I think, again, we don't see a lot of these things because they're under the radar, and it's interest of both sides, both the victim and the attacker, to keep it under the radar. But people should answer some questions. For example, when there was a Russian operation in Crimea, the telecommunications system of Crimea didn't work. This operation was done without any single bullet. They didn't have to sort of explode any underwater fiber optic cables or cut it down, but somehow the systems has been shut. And we can hear about the energetic bear, etc. I totally agree with you. There is much less visibility, and I think in many organizations, especially in sort of classical critical infrastructure organizations, the detection methods are not there. And I know there is a big movement. We'll see more of this in 2015, and definitely in 2016 we'll see laws being passed, regulations being passed to install, I would say, threat detection or risk detection systems in financial organizations, in industrial organizations. We are in touch with NIST and other organizations, and I can say that today's assumption is not that you might be affected by cyber security attack. The assumption is that any organization will be affected by cyber security attack. It will penetrate the existing protection systems, and that's why detection systems become more important. And when we will have those detection systems, I guess people will be surprised by the number of attacks, by the severity of attacks. We already see it in financial organizations. We see more and more sort of results of break-ins. And by the way, in most of the cases, the attack against the organization was not discovered by the organization itself. It was discovered because somewhere in the darknet, credit cards appeared. Somewhere in the darknet, transactions started. And it was brought to the respective people in the organization, and then they understood that the organization had been breached. Again, when it's financial transactions, it's much easier to see them because you see sort of list of 100 million credit cards, and then you can see who those customers are and which organizations they belong to. When we talk about shutdown of critical infrastructure, it's much more difficult to see. So I think that on one hand, we will see more of the attacks, more sponsored state attacks, more smaller companies starting to play games or starting to be sort of players in this big game of cyber warfare, more people using cyber means to conduct crime, whether it's steal money or whether it's blackmail others, etc. And I think that we will also see more organizations installing detection systems and probably reporting more of those attacks.
Yeah, I'm curious to get your thoughts on kind of like cyber espionage. You know, as you were talking about, you know, a lot more countries are kind of, you know, getting involved in that. And, you know, at least here in the U.S., there's always talk about how, you know, all the U.S. and China are going to kind of come to an agreement to stop doing it against each other, but they don't. So just wondering if there's really any way to stop that or kind of rein that in, or if it's just something you think is going to keep happening.
Oh, I think it will be happening much more. We can see sort of that the market is ready for that. Let's look at the positive side. Let's look at a company called CyberArk that has been floated on the stock exchange just a few months ago at a valuation of, if I recall, $400 million, and within few months, the valuation is already over $1 billion. So people who invested in this company did very well, and the reason is because this company deals with privileged access and managing privileged access identities. Snowden had privileged access and abused it. And today we see a different way of cyber espionage. We see organizations, governments hacking into private computers of executives, stealing information and using their private computers or private phones to hack into the protected private organizational networks. I think we'll see more of that trend. There is another trend that is very much related to cyber espionage. It really started during the last 3 months, and we will see more of that. Because in the past, cyber espionage was mainly done by the government. Then it moved towards industrial cyber espionage. So let's hack to each other's networks and steal some information. And now we see first signs of trading activities. So hackers are hacking into computers of executives on the Wall Street, of top analysts or top traders, which are not really concerned about cybersecurity because they don't think that they have some valuable information, but it's an amazing information for the hackers because they can buy and sell shares based on their inside information that they're getting from breaking into Wall Street executive computers.
I wanted to ask you, your opinion about the U.S. I'm always interested when I talk to people who, don't live here in the United States, what their thought is, because the U.S. is kind of at the center of a lot of this cyber espionage talk, and with the NSA and Edward Snowden and, all these nation-to-nation kind of attacks. Just wondering if you kind of have any opinion or thought on how the U.S. is viewed.
Yes, so first of all, the United States is definitely considered to be the most wired country in the world and the most attacked country in the world. I think if you look at the darknet and if you look at the sort of traffic, you can see that the United States is a very desirable target for many countries all around the world, especially the bad guys. And my personal opinion is that the same way as a country has the right to protect itself using military means if it's being attacked, I think country has the right to protect it using cyber security means if it's being attacked. And I think the United States is definitely, at least from my point of view, that takes all the necessary steps to make sure that it is protected. I think there is an understanding of what systems can be doing. And since allegedly some of the systems or methods are being used by NSA, there is a knowledge of what can be done and the protection systems being installed. I think the pace is not fast enough. And I think that definitely more regulation is needed and more collaboration is needed. What's really unique about cybersecurity attacks, and this is not new, but we'll see more of that in 2015, is that people use in different countries and different geographical areas to conduct an attack. So in the past, countries like Israel assume that they can be protected if they will just control its gateway to the world. Israel have a few single gateways. But today it's clear that hackers or bad guys can hack into hundreds of thousands of local computers and use those computers as repeaters, as amplifiers for their attacks. So even the notion of attack coming from abroad, attacks coming from within is changing. And since you ask my opinion about the United States, I think it has been a very, very long time since enemies' boots touched United States soil. And what's really happening now is that there are a lot of enemies' boots on the U.S. soil, on the U.S. virtual or cyber arena soil. You have malware and you have agents from many countries sitting within computers inside the United States as sleeping agents, as active agents, agents of destruction. I think that 2014 and more of the 2015 and 2016 are years where this notion of we will not allow enemies' boots to be on our soil is changing. If 30 years ago I will tell you that there is a demolition engine or big demolition truck sitting somewhere in New York and it belongs to the enemy, probably nobody will sort of say that it's logical. But today, if you go to computers of organizations, of private users, of top executives in New York, you will find sort of demolition devices, virtual demolition devices, sitting in their computers.
That's it for this week's conversation with Mark Gazit, CEO of ThetaRay. If you enjoy the podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen, and check out the HackSurfer community at hacksurfer.com or Surfwatch Labs data at surfwatchlabs.com.